Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Ain't What It Used to Be, Changing How We Do World Heritage. I'm Susan Fayard, World Heritage and Regional Development Lead at the City of Ballarat, and I'll be facilitating today's session. This is part of National Trust Victoria's Australian Heritage Festival and presented in partnership with the Victorian Goldfields World Heritage Bid. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands we're all joining from and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'm joining you from Jandak today. We extend that respect to all First Peoples who are here with us today. Today is about how World Heritage practice is changing, moving from fixed narratives to approaches shaped by First Peoples, communities, and evolving values. The Victorian Goldfields World Heritage Bid, which after 30 years is now on Australia's World Heritage Tentative List, reflects that shift towards a more collaborative and landscape-based approach. This is an audience-led conversation guided by your submitted questions. We've included as many questions as we can, and we'll be sure to work through any that we don't have time to get to after the event. And just a note, today's session is being recorded. So let's introduce our panel today. Firstly, Crystal Buckley AM. Crystal is a Melbourne-based heritage consultant with a background in archaeology, anthropology and public policy. She is a former international vice president of ICOMOS and a current member of the Australian Heritage Council. Thanks, Crystal. Next, Rebecca O'Brien. Rebecca is Principal Heritage Policy World Heritage at Heritage Victoria. She previously led policy at Heritage New Zealand and is now leading the Victorian Government's World Heritage nomination for the Victorian Goldfields and Trades Hall. Hi, Rebecca. Next is Sophia Jackson. Sophia is a Jarrah woman, archaeologist and historian specialising in Indigenous cultural heritage. She leads strategic projects and heritage assessments for Jarrah, focusing on protecting cultural values and revitalising Jarrah narratives of people and place. Hi, Sophia. And last but not least is Trevor Budj AM. Trevor is Strategic Advisor to the Victorian Goldfields World Heritage nomination. He's a former senior leader at the City of Greater Bendigo and academic, and his involvement in the bid dates all the way back to 1989. Hello, Trevor. Thank you all for being here. So we're going to start the panel session today with a question that we'll throw to each of you. The first is, what's one key way World Heritage practice has changed in recent decades, and what is different about the Victorian Goldfields World Heritage Bid, if anything? I'll throw to Crystal first. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan, and good afternoon to all the people attending today. I'm going to speak on at the level of the World Heritage System itself, and I think it's very hard to just name one thing that's changed because everything has changed. In fact, the World Heritage System is very much unrecognisable probably to the people who drafted those words in 1972. However, I'm just going to mention the issue of engagement is entirely different today than it was in the past, deeper, broader, and more meaningful, including the process of preliminary assessment, which I know one of my colleagues is going to tell you more about in a moment, which is a brand new process which is compulsory from next year for all World Heritage nominations. But the engagement with rights holders and stakeholders is much more authentic and considered part of World Heritage nominations today, far, far more so than it was in the past. And there's also a broadened recognition of what counts as natural and cultural heritage, including attention to the intangible dimensions of both and the interrelationships of nature and culture, and inclusion of places that represent the memory of recent conflicts, for example, is a new area of work for the World Heritage System. So there's new types of heritage, and there's certainly new processes and many more voices involved in the processes of nominating and considering the places that should be included in the World Heritage List today. So I'll come back to some of those themes further in the webinar if possible, but thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Crystal. And I'll throw to Rebecca. Same question. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. And good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. For me, one of the standout aspects that has changed in World Heritage is the fact that there seems to be a lot of concentration on it just at the moment. Australia has 21 properties on the World Heritage List, and just 2 of those are in Victoria. So we have the extraordinary Budj cultural landscape and the Royal Exhibition Building. And at the moment in Victoria, we're progressing 2 further nominations at the moment, including the Victorian Goldfields. So it's an exciting time for sharing Victoria's heritage with potentially the world. It's very exciting. One of the key things I think is different now from when Victoria last did a World Heritage nomination back in 2019 with the Budj nomination is that some of the requirements for World Heritage listing have changed, and they changed in that same year that Budj went through. So since 2019, there's been a new requirement that you consider aspects such as gender equality in all World Heritage nominations. And one of the reasons for that is to try and ensure that the stories of women and girls are represented in the World Heritage List. And there's also the requirement, which I know Sophia will cover, to ensure that there is free, prior and informed consent of traditional owners for all nominations going forward. So it's a different time for World Heritage, but also a really exciting time because Australia is working hard to progress some of its wonderful heritage on the world stage. Thanks, Sue.
Thanks, Rebecca. And same question to you, Sophia. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. Good afternoon, everyone. So there seems to be a real shift in the process of developing a nomination to a collaborative approach with a range of stakeholders, including First Nations. That not only aims to provide protection and conservation, but also includes a shared value. So this nomination includes First Nations as stakeholders and equal partners in determining the protection, management and presentation of the Victorian Goldfields nomination, which has also shifted the narrative away from a focused, narrow story to a holistic perspective that includes the minority. Thanks, Sue.
Thanks, Sophia. And finally, Trevor. Trevor, you're on mute. You need to unmute. We knew we were going to have one.
We knew we'd do that. Sorry, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I reflect on the fact that when I speak to people who've been involved with nominations in the past, perhaps 20 plus years ago, they always tell me how little they seem to have to do to get a nomination up compared with now. And when I say that to people, they seem, a little bit dispirited that we've got to go through such an enormous process. But I answer it by saying, if it was easy to get nomination, it probably wouldn't be worthwhile. And I'll just reflect on one element that keeps coming up. And we hear this from Crystal, and we hear it from Barry Gamble, our World Heritage Advisor. As each of the nominations come through, questions that perhaps even 5 years ago would never have been on the agenda are increasingly being asked. And so when you start to do a management plan, which is a requirement for a full nomination, people ask questions like, so have you considered climate change? Which of course, it just reflects the contemporary way in which UNESCO and the World Heritage Committee is addressing issues that are going to affect places that if we get them on the World Heritage List, they are there forever. And so we cannot ignore what are the emerging trends. So that, I think, adds to the sort of comments that have been made by the others.
Thanks, Trevor, and thanks to everyone on the panel. Now we're going to move on to the Q&A. So these are a number of questions that have been submitted and themes by our audience today. I'm going to start with Crystal. On a global scale, what does World Heritage listing mean for a place? And some of the things that people have asked about, for example, could listings support the long-term conservation of heritage features that are currently deteriorating, and I think someone mentioned things like cemeteries, and how are decisions made about which places are prioritised for protection and management through World Heritage? Thanks, Crystal.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks to whoever put the question. It's a huge question. Would take more than just the webinar to really drill into those. But, you know, essentially what World Heritage Listing does globally is it includes the nominated place or places in a very exclusive list of places that are considered to be of value to humanity as a whole, transcending their national or local significance, although those are always very important and not to be forgotten either. This creates expectations and commitment. The expectation is that the relevant, that whatever resources and are needed to achieve protection will be provided, and that the state party, or in this case, the Australian government, will stay with this commitment over the long term. So it's a very serious commitment. However, the protection and management mechanisms that are applied are those that we're already very familiar with, because they're provided at the national, state and local levels. There's no UNESCO level that comes in and creates different requirements. So those legal frameworks that we have in place in Victoria, in the various municipalities that are affected by this nomination and through the National Heritage System, will be used to ensure the long-term protection. It's true, though, that World Heritage Listing also potentially shines a brighter light on places. It can be a vector for investment and additional resources, although sitting back and waiting for those additional resources to just roll in and cover everything you could ever want is quite an ineffective strategy. So using World Heritage as a tool for enhancing the resources, enhancing the appreciation, enhancing visitation and the community benefits are really the challenge that I know the whole team has been working on with this nomination since way back from Trevor's experiences. I think the other thing to say, though, is that World Heritage is necessarily a process of selection. It won't be every part of the goldfields, every single site, house, piece of land, but rather a select set of components which are proposed for the nomination, and with those come attributes, and it's the attributes that the World Heritage Committee expects to see protected and well managed. Now, what those attributes are can be tangible or intangible, but they need to be identified in the World Heritage nomination dossier itself. So that's one of the things that Trevor mentioned that's kind of become much more complex and detailed than it was in the past. So prioritization is always a problem. There's no country that doesn't struggle with prioritizing the allocation of resources for conservation, but clearly World Heritage gives kind of higher level consideration for protection management and resourcing. It also provides a much greater interest for tourism in many cases. So, what I'd like to say is that on the global level, World Heritage can be an important tool, but it must be picked up and used to be effective. That's probably enough for this short Q&A part, Susan, but I'm sure we're going to come back to those issues again and again throughout the session.
Thanks, Crystal. Very pertinent points. We're now going to go to Rebecca to answer a question about the Victorian Goldfields World Heritage nomination, and just wondering if you could give us an overview of the nomination itself and where we're currently in the process, and how does the preliminary assessment that was mentioned earlier fit into the pathway for inscription? Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks, Sue, and thanks for the question. So the Victorian Goldfields, excitingly for Victoria, has been recognised by experts as being the most extensive and the best surviving gold rush landscape in the world. This is partly thanks to the fact that we've got a really dry climate here in Victoria, which has meant that the sites that we have are exceptionally well preserved. The story of the gold rushes, though, is very complex. What we're proposing to do is to put it forward as a serial nomination. So what that means is that we are looking to put forward a small number of places across Victoria to tell the story of the gold rushes. I think of it like a jigsaw puzzle, that we will have a number of different pieces and that each piece will contribute part of the story, and that together all of those pieces will help us see the full picture of the gold rush period. What those pieces will do is help people to understand the size and the scale of the gold rushes here in Victoria, how gold was found, what different techniques were used, also the experiences of traditional owners during those rushes, and the stories of the people that came here to seek their fortunes. I can see in the chat that there is a question around the period that we're looking at. We're looking at the period from 1851, when we had the first rushes start, through to 1900. So World Heritage listing is expected to bring significant benefits to Victoria's regions. And this is the reason that the Victorian government provided funding towards this project. So that was $2 million towards exploring World Heritage listing. And just want to acknowledge the huge number of people that have been working together to bring this nomination about. In terms of where we are in the process, we have come a long way. We have reached the first formal milestone in the World Heritage listing process, which is tentative listing. And that was achieved recently. And what that means is that Australia has confirmed that, in its view, this is a nomination that has strong potential to go forward. We're now in the next stage of the formal process, and that is looking at preliminary assessment. So as Crystal mentioned, this is a brand new process that has been introduced to World Heritage listing. What we have to do now is to document in around 50 pages, so not very long, why the Victorian Goldfields should be included in the World Heritage List. And we'll submit that document through to UNESCO, and they will advise us on whether they consider the nomination is likely to succeed, and also what could be done to strengthen the nomination before it is formally submitted. So if UNESCO confirms that it is a strong nomination to put forward, the earliest that we could submit that nomination is around 2029 for a decision in around 2030. So all the advice that we have received so far is that we do have a very strong candidate in the Victorian Goldfields. And should we achieve World Heritage listing, I should say this is really just the start of the work to ensure that the Victorian Goldfields and the stories that it represents are preserved in perpetuity and shared with a wider audience. Thanks, Sue.
Thanks, Rebecca. Very long process, but well worth it. I'm now going to ask Sophia to answer a question. It's how is engagement with traditional owner groups going, and how has their input shaped the nomination and its direction? Thanks.
Thanks, Sue, and thank you for the question. So JARA has been involved in the Victorian Goldfields nomination from early phases of the project, and over the past 2.5 years, have been actively involved in the development of the nomination. JARA has also led engagement with other traditional owners as well involved in the nomination. In the early phases of the nomination, the government determined that free, prior, informed consent was required. So free, prior, informed consent is recognised as a prerequisite for any activity that affects First Nations ancestral lands, territories and natural resources, and also recognises all peoples have the right to self-determination, and linked to that right, all peoples have the right to freely pursue their economic and social cultural development. With that, JARA developed an epic framework that focuses on traditional owner-led consultation and includes a pliable process that allows for change over time, transparent relationships between traditional owners and the government that fosters collaboration, a framework that allows cultural processes, and importantly ensures a genuine self-determination process. This process enabled JARA to develop our own engagement plan, which included 5 gates where consultation is required throughout the duration of the project. The engagement plan also recognises what appropriate consultation looks like and how JARA want to be involved with the nomination through all phases of the project. Governance, intertwining cultural law into a unique governance model. Opportunities, what are the shared values for JARA? And importantly, risks. How does JARA interact with a history that caused widespread displacement of people and country? A disconnect that continues today, which we are reminded of when we interact with country and we see upside down country. Going through the FPIC process provided a platform to determine the shared value for JARA through the tentative listing phase and the preliminary assessment phase we're currently going through at the moment. This opened opportunities for the inclusion of significant cultural places, cultural research, and the development of cultural values assessment. Also enabling JARA to recommend the Lani-Baramal landscape or Lalgambuk, Mount Franklin and Funkenford for the nomination. This landscape represents JARA's resilient culture and deep connection to country, from the Dreamtime and the last eruption of Lalgambuk to the imposition of upside down country and the dislocation of people and place through to the cultural, vibrant, self-determined JARA of today. So with the economic support from the government and through the development of the cultural values assessment across the project, we have been able to determine a JARA-led theme and narrative across the whole listing. Ultimately, this provides JARA with a platform to tell First Nations stories in our own language on a world stage. Thank you, Sue.
Thanks, Sophia. Amazing work. I'm now going to go to Trevor, and a big question, Trevor. This nomination spans 15 councils and a wide range of rights holders and stakeholders. How do you manage collaboration at this scale, and what has made it work? Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. It sounds daunting, but I reflect on the fact that quite a number of successful nominations are actually transnational nominations. So if a group of countries can get together and put forward a nomination and convince the assessors that they can work together, then theoretically it should be relatively easy for a group of municipalities. But as you indicate, there are now 15 municipalities signed up to a memorandum of understanding. But I reflect on the fact that 40 years ago, when this project was first mooted, we held a meeting in Maryborough in central Victoria, and this is pre-amalgamation of councils, and over 40 councils turned up because they all had goldfields country. So in part, municipal amalgamations have helped us a little bit, reduce the number, but it's been a unique process to have so many councils committed to a long-term project. And when we first signed that memorandum of understanding, one of the things we stressed with them that this was going to be about a 10-year process. And as it's turned out, we happened to get it about right. So as Rebecca has indicated, our first attempt to get nomination will probably be decided in 2030. So a 10-year process. So keeping 15 councils together over such a long period of time takes a lot of consultation, a lot of engagement, a lot of building of trust. You've got to remember that just like federal and state politics, councils change. New councillors come along, new CEOs come along. And it's interesting that last Friday we had a meeting in Bendigo, and we had 14 of the 15 mayors and CEOs of those councils at the meeting, all confirming their support. One of the unique things that went into the memorandum of understanding was to bring on board 2 co-patrons. We were fortunate that John Brumby and Dennis Napthine, from opposite sides of politics, both ex-premiers, very strongly supported this project. And so part of the the process really is to ensure that you have a widely representative group of people behind it, and not just simply the immediate players that appear to be in front of you. Sophia's given you an excellent account of where we're going with First Peoples, but there are other groups and organisations. We have historical societies, which I think every town has got an historical society. We have the National Trust itself, who's been very supportive. We have tourism groups and organisations, business groups and communities generally. So a lot of it's about regular engagement with those groups and ensuring that they're up to speed with the information, but constantly working the system to make sure that they know where we're going and what they can expect. Thanks, Sue.
Thanks, Trevor. I'm going to come back to Rebecca now with another big question. We've got lots of big questions from the audience. This is in two parts. The first is, how will the stories and values of the Victorian Goldfields be made more relevant and accessible to diverse audiences, particularly young people and newer Australians? And the second part is, and what work has been done to strengthen the visibility of women's stories within the Goldfields narrative and the bid more broadly? Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks, Sue, and great questions. One of the things that has really struck me throughout all of the time that I've worked on this project is how many people involved and how many people that we talk to have family connections to the gold rushes. And I think there'll be many of the people listening today that have those same connections. And what that says to me is that the size and the scale of those gold rushes was so influential here in Australia, but across the world. I think that connection is a real opportunity for us to find new ways to share stories of people here with the rest of the world. I think the spread of the Victorian Goldfields across Victoria also means that there'll be a place near where people live in Victoria that they can go to explore and understand more about what happened in that second half of the 19th century. We're doing quite a bit of work to understand what the views and needs are of women, young people and others as we develop the work on the project. Just looking at the work to understand how to share the stories of women, for example. In Victoria, new legislation was introduced in 2020. It's the Gender Equality Act. And what that piece of legislation did is require us to look specifically in any big project like this one on what we can do to improve and promote gender equality in the project. For this project, what we've done is commission particular research to understand the stories of women and children, women and girls on the goldfields. And Trevor's done an enormous amount of work on this himself. We've then taken those stories and worked to highlight those as we talk about the gold rushes. And what I've found is a lot of people who had seen the gold rushes as something that is of significance to a very select small group of people. They think of like male miners coming out, suddenly realizing that there is such a lot of other stories that can be told. And what we're seeing this nomination develop into is a story of the underrepresented. So the Victorian Goldfields are a way that we can tell stories of people whose lives have been hidden before. This is a real opportunity to share some of those unknown stories. And I think that's one, for me personally, one of the really exciting things about this particular nomination. Thanks, Sue.
Thanks, Rebecca. It's very, very important. I'm going to go back to Trevor now. The gold rush drove extraordinary waves of migration and cultural exchange, and I think a lot of the discussion we've just heard now goes to that. Are there plans to expand the actual communication and engagement that's being done to better highlight the multicultural histories and communities of the goldfields? Thanks.
Thanks. So, look, it's a really interesting, important question. Rebecca's touched on some elements of it, but if I just give you a few statistics to round out how significant this is and how it's driving the way in which we approach the issues. If we refer, for instance, I think everyone's familiar that the Chinese were a significant component of the mining community. People may not know just how significant they were, but from about 1857, we can document that there were at least 25,000 Chinese on the goldfields of Victoria, and that number survived up until at least the late 1860s. From all the evidence we've got, it probably hit 35,000 somewhere between 1857 and 1861. And in some cases, on some goldfields, such as Beechworth was a good example, 25% of all the miners on Beechworth were Chinese born. If we go to the role of women, I think, as Rebecca has indicated, the sort of worldwide view of gold mining rushes is that it's a masculine event. And that certainly was the case if we look at places like Otago and California and Klondike in Alaska. But when we look at the statistics in Victoria, what we find is that right from the very earliest records we have of how many people were on each of the gold rush sites, there are always women and there are always children. And that is quite unusual, to the point where by about 1860, about 30% of the population that were on each of the gold rush sites were women. In fact, at the 1861 census, there were 278 recorded gold rush sites, and all but 2 of them had women. And I'm talking here from very early days, even remote fields, and people would know Omeo as one of the most remote fields, even in 1854 in Omeo, and I'm not sure just how people got to Omeo in 1854, but there were women on that goldfield and there were children on that goldfield. So this idea that there were waves of people is really important. Often the number of people that came to the Victorian goldfields is understated because people just look at the census results and say, well, that's the population increase. But it's more complex than that because people arrived, but people also left. And from all our work that we've been able to do, we've been able to identify that at least in that first decade, there were 635,000 people came. 635,000, if you think about that in terms of the scale, and migration's still a debate in Australia. And yet in that period, the population of Victoria grew from 77,000 people in 1851, just before the gold rushes, and something like 635,000 plus people came in that period. Some of them travelled overland from other colonies, but most of them came from Europe, obviously Great Britain, China, America, and so on.
Thanks, Trevor. And I think just for the audience, that this reframing that's happening of the Victorian goldfields in all of these facets is really important because it's something that's going to be shared and communicated and shift understanding of the place. And we see this in many World Heritage places around the world. Crystal, I'm going to go to you next. What are the key management considerations for a World Heritage site? And are there emerging priorities such as climate change that will shape how these places are managed into the future? Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. And just for you and the other organisers, I wanted to let you know that I can't see the chat. So if there are any other aspects of this question, please let me know what they are. But anyway, the whole point of management or management system in World Heritage is to work out how to specifically sustain the identified heritage values over the long term. And as Rebecca already explained, the approach being taken for this nomination is the serial approach, which means that there'll be more than one mapped area included in the proposal, but it'll be treated by the World Heritage Committee as a single property. So the first thing with serial properties is there needs to be very good coordination. So when Trevor talks about all the discussions that have been had with all those local governments and state and national government authorities as well, this is the essential foundation for doing management well, because without those relationships and without that ability to coordinate between different responsibilities in different places, it can fall apart very easily, as I'm sure we can all guess. In fact, management and what needs to be done under the rubric of management varies across the world from place to place, but also varies over time. And what I think the World Heritage Committee expects is that things that will be workable in their local and national context will be developed. So we call this the management system. It goes beyond the legal protection, which is essential, but we begin to then identify how decisions about change to these places might be made, because change is ever present. We have tools like heritage impact assessment, which are a necessary part of the management suite. We need to, the management system needs to ensure participatory approaches and respect for cultural rights are embedded in the way things are done here. Management also has to identify the main pressures on conservation, what kinds of factors need to be managed, what kinds of threats, if you like, may be present. There are always many, so nominations that come in and say we don't have any threats are considered to be very unlikely to be accurate. So what are the main pressures that could affect conservation over the long term, and what kinds of actions or proactive mechanisms need to be put in place to respond to those pressures? So management is not a cookie cutter exercise where you just get one off the shelf and copy paste it all into, you know, whatever place you're working. It has to be really tailored to the place, what's vulnerable about it, what are its strengths, and what kinds of pressures apply. How will we manage these places over the long term? And that requires monitoring. So monitoring is a requirement of management in the World Heritage System. We need to know how we're going. We need to make sure a good state of conservation is maintained, and to notice when new factors and pressures arise, as is the case with the climate crisis, which Susan mentioned in the question. The pressures and threats don't stay the same over time. So monitoring is absolutely important to make sure that new factors are identified when they arise and management is adapted to address them. Management needs to identify how the needed expertise and other resources will be made available to the property. Again, this varies completely from place to place throughout the world, so it needs to be tailored to the needs of this particular set of places. And management plans, which put all this information together for the benefit of both the site managers and the World Heritage Committee, usually supported by other plans, such as plans for sustainable tourism, plans for interpretation, which Rebecca and Trevor have both spoken about already, plans for risk management. And of course, when we talk about risk management, one of the key elements that we're all dealing with everywhere in the world, but in so many different ways, is the climate crisis. It is a requirement to give consideration to existing and future climate impacts on World Heritage properties. It's generally acknowledged that that these may be quite difficult to manage and require a lot of collaboration and sharing of information about tools and promising approaches. That's perhaps one of the benefits of being in the World Heritage List, is being part of those conversations. So I'm just not sure if there's other aspects you want me to cover, but what I'd like to say about management is a very dynamic process, and it's never finished. It's always rolling forward. It's always considering new challenges and new opportunities, because management should also look at the flows of benefits to communities, both economic, social, and symbolic. So all of that should be kind of thought through as part of the management planning process, always at its heart, remembering the outstanding universal value of the property itself and how it will be sustained long term. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks, Crystal. It's a big question, and you did that really well. Thank you. We've got a little bit of extra time. There was another question. I might just throw to Crystal and Trevor on this one, if that's okay. We've had a question regarding the IUCN. For people who don't know, IUCN and ICOMOS that we've mentioned are the World Heritage Advisory Bodies. So this is regarding IUCN's key geo-heritage areas overlay over World Heritage areas. The person's asked about how its implementation may change interpretation of values. I know it's quite a specific question, but Crystal, have you got anything, any information on this at all? Thanks.
Yeah, not very much. So probably some people in the audience know more about this than we do. But as Susan said, IUCN is the World Heritage Advisory Body for Nature, ICOMOS for Culture. But both organizations have a much bigger span of work and interest than just the World Heritage work that they do. So this kind of work on geoheritage is being done within IUCN's broader mandate, and is not necessarily one that is, if you like, binding on the World Heritage aspects. It's really just in a kind of awareness raising and important. Sorry, that made it sound like I didn't think it's important. I do. It's about recognizing the importance of geoheritage in many, many places. I said before that one of the things that's really started to shift in World Heritage, not easily and not before time, is the recognition that so often natural and cultural aspects of every place are often inseparable, interrelated, and unnecessarily separated by the system that we have. So recognizing at a descriptive level how aspects of the natural environment have shaped the cultural histories of a place is absolutely essential. But the case that's being built here for the Goldfields is based solely on its cultural heritage values. So IUCN will not be directly involved in the evaluation of the nomination, as far as I understand the form it's going forward in. And those sorts of resources that IUCN have are really important sources for interpretation, for description, and for really deepening the understanding of the places we have, but are not necessarily built into the justification for outstanding universal value. So in a sense, they're not mandatory requirements, but rather enriching sources of information. But I know Trevor wants to speak about the geology of the Goldfields because it is so fascinating. So I might stop there and let him do that.
Thanks, Crystal. Yeah, the question touches on one of the most important elements, really, and that is how do you explain Victoria's gold mining landscape? And it really is explained by the geology, and this is another area where Victoria stands out on a comparative analysis. Most of the other major gold mining areas in the world in the second half of the 19th century are really only based on one type of geology. And that led almost exclusively to one type of mining, not always, but mostly, and that is large-scale hydraulic sluicing. Whereas in Victoria, because we had gold underneath the volcanic lava flows, creating what's called the buried rivers of gold, we had that form of gold mining, deep lead mining. We obviously had the alluvial mining, which was really the start of the rushes in the early 1850s. But then we had the deep quartz reef mining associated with places like Bendigo and Ballarat, where they were down 1,500 metres, the deepest mines in the world at the time. Then we have our own examples of hydraulic sluicing, not nearly as substantial. We also have some very unusual examples of open cut gold mining. Very few places in the world have that. And then, of course, you have something like a Walhalla, where you have horizontal hard rock tunnelling. Now, when you compare the geology of the Victorian fields with the geology of these other places, they're dominated by one form of mining, and the most expansive comparative mining area is California. All the mining basically took place on the western front of the Sierra Nevada range, and it's the one type of landscape. Therefore, the one type of gold mining predominates. So here's another aspect of what Rebecca said, the best surviving example of a gold mining landscape in the world. It actually comprises a number of different types of geology, a number of different types of how gold was discovered and how it was mined.
Thanks, Trevor and Crystal. And that deep time story is really important, as Trevor mentioned, on many levels, particularly cultural levels as well. We're going to now throw to any audience questions, if anyone has. There's a Q&A section in the Teams link that you can go into and ask additional questions. We've had one come in when someone registered just today. So I'm going to throw this one to Trevor, actually. The questions, will local authors and publishers have opportunities to produce and sell maps and guides on the regional goldfields, or will the government-produced free materials remain the primary model?
Interesting question. I think the obvious answer is that this throws open an enormous opportunity for locals to do that. In fact, what we've had to do is prepare a bibliography of the entire goldfield story, and it is surprising just how much has been written over a long period of time, concentrating on either the totality of the goldfield story, or the story of individual towns, even the story of individual mines, individual buildings. What I think we see in many of these examples around the world is that once you get the focus of a World Heritage listing, it really encourages people and communities, local groups and organisations to start to tell that story, because they've potentially got a lot more visitors, they've got a lot more people who are interested, and whether the government has the resources and the intent to produce its own history, well, that will be a decision for them. But I can guarantee that if 10 years after our listing, assuming we're going to get it, there's going to be a proliferation of material that's come out in that previous decade. So I look forward to seeing the results of that. And I would say that even during the process of doing the nomination, we've had so many people contact us about individual histories of individual places. And we're also seeing a lot more university research. There's so many people now doing PhDs on aspects of this. It's quite remarkable. And we are in pretty good contact with quite a number of universities, both here in Australia and overseas, who are interested in this whole story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I might just add too that the thing that's been driving a lot of the partners, particularly the local governments and others, and Sophia mentioned this with Jara, is looking at the opportunities that World Heritage can bring for local people and local communities. And and Crystal also mentioned that the benefits, I guess, and Rebecca, I can't remember which one it was, sorry, mentioned about the benefits of World Heritage. You've got to make them happen. So, it's really going to be up to local authors, publishers, people in the community, tourism operators, to actually make something of World Heritage and grab it and use it. And I think that's a real core driver that we're doing at the moment. We've got a couple of questions coming in. This one's really interesting. I love this one. So and anyone can throw their hand up for this one. Is the uniqueness of the cuisine coming out of the goldfields going to be part of the story, i.e. the invention of dim sims? I might just add that we've been approached by the Vegemite Museum, who's really interested because the Vegemite creator grew up on the goldfields as well. So would anyone like to talk about that?
I might have a go, Sue.
Yep.
One of the things that the goldfields produced was, because at that time it was so distant from major sources of industry and manufacturing, is that it's not just about food, but it's about the whole process that's associated with living, 12,000 miles away from where you've got if you like, an industrial inventive base. So what had to happen was on the goldfields, lots of things had to be invented. And whilst it's not quite on the goldfields, but you take something like refrigeration, which had enormous impact on what you could do in terms of food, that was invented in Geelong, large-scale refrigeration. So what we saw on the goldfields was people having to live in a pretty rough way at first. But if you have a look at the history of all the major cities across the goldfields, they all were into things like, and I reflect on Bendigo because that's my background, but, I had 2 tomato processing plants in Bendigo, all developed by miners. The Chinese market garden element was extremely important. Have a look at the large areas of land that were set aside in many of the mining communities for market gardens from Chinese. And then, of course, you had the whole issue. They used to call them like unique name, aerated waters, but getting clean water was incredibly important, and that, of course, led to huge number of breweries associated with goldfields. So there are so many stories like this to come out, which this, I think, opens up.
Exactly, and I always think about that there wasn't what we know as an Australian accent at that time either, that it was all of these things together, and the sense of humour from First Peoples, and all of these amazing cultural elements and things that came together to create something like a dim sum, which wasn't really known over in China. So it's a very interesting mix and meld that we still see today. I haven't got any other questions coming through at this stage in the Q&A, but I might just open up to the panel and see if there's anything else that you'd like to, any final comments or things that you'd like to speak about. There's a lot of things we can cover here. I'm happy to either go around the room, the virtual room, or Trevor, go for it.
I think there's one that we haven't really touched on, which is really significant because we hear it from our tourism information centres, and there's about 23 across the goldfields. There's a lot of people searching for family history, and because they've got this family connection. And one of the most important things that each community has, which is the prop for this, is this local cemetery. And there's so many stories can be told out of the local cemetery. And of course, that's a story of childhood mortality, huge numbers of children dying in those early gold rush eras, women dying in childbirth, mining accidents, which is a really major issue, miners dying of lung complaints. So the stories of the cemeteries are important, and then of course our cemeteries also have sections like a Chinese cemetery and so on. So one of the things that local communities perhaps to some extent have neglected over time, although there's some great examples of restoration and maintenance of cemeteries, but I think you're going to find that there's a lot more people are visiting these places and wanting to see that. And of course, many of the churches also hold similar records that are important. So you don't need to look beyond many of the things that already exist in your communities to understand this history. It's a matter of interpreting it.
Thanks, Trevor. Crystal, Rebecca or Sophia, does anyone want to jump in? Any final comments?
Well, I'll jump in very quickly just to say that Trevor's used the word stories quite a number of times, and some of the questions that have come up suggest stories or kinds of stories which are of immense interest. And the thing is, the World Heritage nomination is quite a technical product which will not necessarily contain or explore or celebrate all of those things. But that's not to say that it isn't the purpose of the World Heritage listed place to do that. And I didn't mention before, but often there are research plans and plans for communications and festivals and you know, all those other things that we can think of that often accompany very important heritage places, which should really be something that the management system carries forward. So it's not that all the questions are tied up and completely answered and finished because you've got to the point where you can submit the nomination. It's really just the beginning. World Heritage listing is, you know, it feels like an end because you've been working on it for so long, and it's been a lot of tasks that have had to be completed. But it's really just the beginning of what the what World Heritage could be used to achieve in the region, and I think that's much more motivating than the task of getting all these technical documents compiled and put together properly, even though that's what we're doing right now. So I wish the team all the best and hope the communities are really excited about this possibility. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks. And we've got a tiny little bit of time. I'm going to do a question without notice, and it's a one-word question, just one word. Of if you could sum up a word that kind of expresses the feeling of the change that's happening in World Heritage, or the change that's happening through the World Heritage bid. And Crystal, I'll start with you again because you're first on my screen. If you had one, you can go to 2 words maybe, but what would one word be? Yeah.
Well, I already had my one word before, which was engagement. So now you're giving me another one. It's very kind. It would be, I think it would be optimism. And, you know, it's not a word we get to use a lot in the current world, but it's one where, you know, there is a kind of idealistic idea of international cooperation to recognize something that's important to all of us. So that would be mine. Thanks.
Thanks. We'll go to Rebecca.
Thanks, Sue. For me, I think it's opportunity. I think in a time when World Heritage is changing quite a bit, we have an opportunity to help shape what that looks like in Victoria and in Australia. And I think it's a really exciting time for that reason.
Thanks, Rebecca. Sophia, 1 to 2 words, yeah.
Thanks, Sue. I would say probably an incredible journey. We're really looking forward to seeing how the bid progresses here at JARA.
Thanks, Sophia. And Trevor?
I'll use the word enlightening. And what I mean by that is that the process, the lengthy process, has actually enlightened us all. We've discovered and uncovered things that we didn't really know much about, and it's because of the length of the process, because of the rigor of the process, and because we've had a team of people who are prepared to chase down all sorts of things, down all sorts of rabbit burrows to find information. And we now know so much more about the Victorian Goldfields, so we've been enlightened.
That's brilliant. I couldn't have summed any of that up myself. That's so good. So I'd like to, in conclusion, thank our panel and to everyone who's joined us today. This conversation shows how heritage continues to evolve and how we want it to continue to evolve, I think, that came through then, and how we actually shape that together, importantly. If you'd like to learn more about the Victorian Goldfields World Heritage bid, you can visit our website, which is goldfieldsworldheritage.com.au, and follow the bid as it progresses by signing up to our monthly e-news, as well as there's a ton of information on that website. So thank you again, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the festival. Thanks, National Trust. Bye.